So for people who are coming in early, I'm really excited. You can go ahead and get your supplies ready. We're going to be working with a drawing pad, and you can work with either charcoal or graphite, kneaded eraser. And also, I'd say have a notebook ready to take notes down. So a notebook and pen or a notebook and pencil. We're going to be going over terminology. And sometimes, I don't know, when I'm learning new stuff, it helps if I write it down. It helps stick to the memory better. So to get the supplies ready, we're going to be working on a drawing surface as well as a sketchbook. Like I have a sketchbook here that's 7 by 10 inches, or it could be a large size paper, like 18 by 24 newsprint, if you'd like. I have here one of the demos I did for this workshop in this little sketchbook right here. So you can work at whatever scale you feel most comfortable with. So as we are prepping to start the workshop, the supplies that we're going to be using are, it could be a sketchbook. I have a 7 by 10 inch sketchbook with graphite. You could use different types of graphite, anywhere from the H, 2H, 4H down to 2B, 4B, 6B, whatever you feel comfortable with. You could also work on newsprint if you'd like with charcoal. I would recommend having a notebook available to jot some notes down as we're talking about the different vocabulary and applications. So if you want to, I'll combine my sketch and drawings with notes. And so in my sketchbooks, a lot of times I'll have a drawing and then there's also notes on top of that drawing. So whatever suits you best, but we'll keep the supplies to a minimal of a nice sheet of drawing paper or sketchbook paper, or if you want to work with an easel on an 18 by 24, you can do that. Whatever setup is more easy for you to easily work with. Okay.
All right, I guess we can get started. Thank you everyone for joining us to Co-Creative Sessions. This is Drawing the Beauty Around Us, taught by Kat Knutsen from New Bedford, Massachusetts. We're lucky to have Kat teaching us today, and this is funded by the Barr Foundation and TDI Mass Development for the Creative Cities Initiative in New Bedford, Massachusetts. So I will give the floor over to Kat. If you have any questions along the process, just put them in the chat. We have myself and Kyle as a moderator, so we can answer some of your questions as we go through the process. All right, Kat, do you want to introduce yourself?
So my name is Kat Knutsen, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. This is a workshop, Drawing the Beauty Around Us. And we're going to be talking about how do we use the medium of drawing to capture a sense of memory and place in our everyday surroundings or surroundings that we frequent. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the presentation and introduce myself a little bit more specifically. Here we go. So for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet or work with in the past, I have a small studio business. It's called Kat Knutsen Studios. It specializes in, currently I've done animation works. I worked on a film, Loving Vincent, in 2016. It was a film about Vincent van Gogh. It was a stop motion painted animation film. And the film did really well. We went to the Oscars with that project in 2018. And then I started working with murals in 2020. This is an image of the first mural that I did that was figurative, but I had the pleasure to work with the Super Flat organization. And so my passion in art is painting people, figurative art, and spaces. And so I have a background in painting. I got my MFA from UMass Dartmouth in 2014, and I've always had a passion for people, capturing people. I've loved expressions, and I love spaces that we occupy. I think that the spaces give a context for what's happening within those spaces. And there's a lot of different ways to capture the essence, of what's going on in the spaces. And so this workshop is about kind of taking a drawing and a sketching approach to analyzing the spaces that are around us. This is an image of a sketch that I did at the Co-Creative Center, downtown New Bedford. This is looking at the corner of the space where all these lovely plants occupy the area. They add a lot of life. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this drawing and the process that I use to create it. And we're going to be learning about some vocabulary and tools that help us take what might seem to be a daunting project, turn into almost more like a step-by-step process that gives us room to really create. And we have these tools at our disposal. I want to talk about some of my influences really quick. I've always been a fan of Van Gogh's palette. He was very colorful. And this particular painting over the recent years has meant a lot to me, especially since I had the pleasure to get to know him a lot more as I was working on that film, Loving Vincent. I had the pleasure to go and visit right outside of this room. And it just means a lot to see the mark making that he did as he's building these structures within the space, the color palette he's using, and the whimsical nature of the shapes. Another one is Andrew Wyeth. I've always loved the essence of, it's not necessarily detail, but texture that Andrew Wyeth is able to capture. He's very sensitive to what I call tonal patterns. If you're ever trying to capture a sense of texture in your work, if you take a look at how the light and darks shift, as well as the edge quality, if it's a very hard edge quality, if it's a very soft quality, and you just look at those tonal patterns moving within the drawing, you can see how artists render a sense of touch in their work. And I love that about Andrew Wyeth's work. Another one is Joseph Turner. I really love this piece because there's a sense of atmosphere. And then I love the kind of the purview that he's giving us to look up within this space. I love the use of light and also the shapes. I love how he uses a sense of rhythm and pattern, and he's using perspective drawing. We're going to go over perspective in a simpler way where we're analyzing how what we call diagonals works to create the illusion of space. But I just love his, like, he's got a harmony going with his, diagonals, the horizontals, the verticals, and this beautiful pattern of the shapes that create the atmosphere in this piece. Another influence, she's a contemporary artist. I love her work. This is Zoe Frank. She's actually doing some really amazing work right now. She just had a big show in New York City. I had the pleasure of doing a workshop with her. And what I love about her work so much is her sense of patterning with her shapes. And she really gives us these really fun paths to go into the spaces with the way that she uses shape and patterning together to kind of create that sense of depth. And then I also love just her sensitivity to edge qualities within those shapes to help give us a sense of that atmosphere. So what we're going to be doing in this workshop, the supplies that you're going to need, and I can give, if you don't have them, I can give you like a couple of minutes to gather them. You're going to need a drawing surface. So either like a good size sketchbook. Again, I'm using a sketchbook that's like a 7 by 10 inch when I was creating some of the content for the class. Or you could also work with newsprint or a drawing board, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And then the drawing material, like a graphite or charcoal, and you're going to need a kneaded eraser. I recommend kneaded because you can really create these fine point eraser opportunities if you have a very tiny mark that you need to get rid of. A polyvinyl eraser is also a really great eraser to get rid of large swaths of material, but it's more difficult to get into those nooks and crannies with a polyvinyl eraser. So a kneaded eraser works really well, but they both will do the job in either case. This is the vocabulary we're going to be using in this workshop. And I'm going to use these words repeatedly to kind of take an analytical approach to drawing the space in front of us. I remember when I was an art student, I started at a community college in Charlotte, North Carolina, back in like 2008. And I remember the puzzle of trying to understand how to draw a space worked. And I kept thinking there has to be some sort of a formula. And I spent years and years researching it. This was a time when this wasn't exactly the key concept pushed in school compared to conceptual art. And so after I finished my MFA, I started to more aggressively sit down and just kind of look at what are the key components that go into drawing spaces around us. And so these are some really good nuts and bolts tools that I found that helped me significantly. So we're going to go over those together. And if you have any questions, again, Dina will be able to field them. So if there's a question about a certain thing that we're going over and you need me to repeat it or like explain it in a different way, just let me know. So the first one's basic shapes. Basic shapes, this kind of brings out a bit of the illustrator. in these, so basic shapes are what make up everything. You have circles, triangles, and squares. Everything in this world is made from a combination of these basic shapes. And if you're thinking of these shapes in a 3D fashion, they're the sphere, the cone, the pyramid, the cube, and I kind of look at the shape language as like a Lego system. Like you look at parts of anatomy, for example, like the hand, it's got a bit of this, cubical quality at the base that bends. You've got the cylinder nature of the fingers. You've got the spherical nature of like the ends of the fingertips. So everything that you observe, it's made of basic shapes. And a lot of times the magic is finding that transition between the basic shapes, and looking at proportion, the scale of them. But whenever something seems really daunting, I'll start to just look for what are the basic shapes that make up the object. Another key thing is measuring unit. Measuring unit is really important to establish early in the drawing because you're trying to figure out how you want to present the scope of a space. So I'm using my charcoal, that's a piece of vine charcoal in my hand at the time, and I'm using the lamp in the far distance as a measuring unit at the beginning of this drawing. Diagonals are another really important thing. Diagonals are basically the magic to perspective. If you combine measuring units with diagonals, perspective is basically there at your disposal to create some really neat spaces. Finding diagonals takes a little bit of a practice at first. When I'm teaching drawing, I'll have my students use something like maybe a knitting needle, or if their drawing device is straight enough, like a pencil, I'll have them use their measuring unit also as a diagonal, like hunter, and I'll have them sight the diagonal, like you see me doing in the screen right now, and I'll have them kind of take a look at what is the specific angle that they're measuring and then try to copy that exact angle. They're not looking at the measuring unit per se at that moment. They're looking at what is the degree of the diagonal. And so it's two separate actions. You've got how long is something or how short is something, and what's the diagonal of it. And there's always a back and forth between those two. And it's extremely important as you're building your drawing to establish a prime measuring unit, because it becomes the key thing that you use to create the rest of the components in your drawing that you're basing it against. It's like a compass that points true north in a way. Next thing is figure ground. So I remember this one used to send me through the loops in school. I didn't quite understand it and grasp it, and I love it. It's one of my favorite things about art now, or making drawings and paintings and anything on the 2D surfaces, figure ground. So figure ground is looking at the negative and positive shapes. And so the positive shape is like a mass, and the negative shapes are like the air that surround the mass. So what it should, rather than saying figure being the object and ground being the space in which that object is occupying, it should be object space. So if I could, I would rename the terminology. Rather than it being figure ground, I would say object space, because you're looking at what is the personality of the negative and positive shapes of the object and the space occupying around the object. So this is a drawing that I did for, let's see, trying to remember the organization. This was for an organization called Third Eye in New Bedford. This was last year, 2020, I believe. And so it was an event where they were hosting a lot of amazing performers in the city and creating this amazing content for when everything had to be online. And so I had to go onto the stage kind of like in the background, and I was trying to capture the essence of what was happening. Now, these actors, these performers, these musicians, these amazing talents, they were not there all at the same time. They kept coming out one at a time, individually performing their acts and then going back. So I had to figure out how to use and establish a sense of scale, my measuring unit, to kind of to create that stage right there that they're standing on, and then also to figure out the general scope of how large each person was going to be when they're occupying the space. Okay, so again, these tools, they're very cumulative, but they don't necessarily have to be in that specific order. But measuring unit with diagonals, with negative positive shape assessment, extremely helps to establish a sense of coherence within a space that I'm trying to capture. This is another example. These are some musicians that I captured. They were performing in the middle of the winter. They're very dedicated musicians. This is right next to the building where that mural was installed that I was talking about a little bit earlier. So there's a group of like very talented jazz musicians that perform on this stage regularly. And so I would go sometimes to listen to them play and also practice drawing and sketching by trying to capture a candid moment of them. And so I would use like looking for the basic shapes. Let's go back over here. I'd go back to trying to figure out what are the basic shapes that I'm looking at. You know, what do I want to create as a measuring unit to establish a sense of scale for how big my drawing is going to depict, how big of a space. And then what are the diagonals that are going to help me keep that sense of scale consistent. And then I would start jumping into the negative positive dynamics of what's going on within the figure ground. If we have some time, because we're going to have a little bit of lab time during this workshop, we're going to go over bits of tonal mapping. Tonal mapping is a part of helping to establish a sense of atmosphere by using the properties of light and shadow to help show things like what's in front of what. It also helps to create a sense of space. Shadows work in perspective as well. But we'll see how we're doing with time and how much time we have to get to the tonal mapping part after everyone's had a chance to try exercising with these other tools first. All right, so this is a demo video that I made, and I figured it would be faster to show you this. And this is kind of a process that I wanted to present to everybody for the workshop to try out. So I'm going to kind of be an orator over the video as we're seeing it. So this is a drawing of a room in my house, and I started off working with big shapes and diagonals and trying to like suss out, you know, which direction are those diagonals going, what's the scale of the shape and whatnot. So I'll go ahead and play that. So I would take photos in between the stages of my drawing to help kind of document the process of that. So measuring unit, I'll go back just a little bit. Here we go. So big shapes and diagonals. If you could see, there's like two sets of diagonals going on right here. That's me kind of doing the guesswork and trying to understand what diagonal is this line going in, because I'm trying to make the surface of the bed sit down in space. And so I'm not getting into any of the details yet. I'm just trying to find those basic forms and looking at those shapes and which way are those diagonals going. As I started to add more to this, I started to create a bit of a measuring unit. And in this case, I was using the part of the blanket right here that falls over the corner as a measuring unit. And so you know how like there's inches on rulers and whatnot? Think of the measuring unit in your drawing as your measuring device. And so you use that throughout the drawing to keep a sense of persistent scale. So in this case, I was using this bit of drapery on the side. When I started to establish more shapes into the drawing, I had to start looking at analyzing what are these passages that are going in between the big shapes. And it would be difficult for me to measure like what's happening right in between the lampstand and the post of the bed. Like I could create a measuring component from this unit over here, but it was actually much easier to kind of look at what is the negative shape that's happening between those and how could I more arrive at a closer resemblance of that negative shape. Again, the negative shapes like the air. So then here comes the fun part, trying to create a rendering of bits of the repeat pattern that are on the blanket, on the spread. This is this beautiful quilt that my mother-in-law made for us. And it's made of these gorgeous like miniature hexagons that group together to form these larger hexagons. And so I was trying to capture that repeat pattern on the blanket that was lying on the surface of the bed, but also try to capture that drape of how the repeat pattern starts to fall off the side of the bed. And so it became, I don't know if you could see these subtle diagonals right here. There's these subtle diagonals. So I would use a measuring component to kind of suss out, okay, the first form, the first shape kind of begins at this corner. This is where I started. And then I started looking for these relationships, diagonals. So the corner of this form right here I looked for the diagonal between it and then that part of the pillow on the bed right there. And so I used that to begin with as a measuring device. I also took this other like corner area where the motif was living, and I tried to find another diagonal relationship to another object. In this case, it was moving towards this window right here. So I just kept looking like, how is it engaging with other forms in the space? If I look for a diagonal, if I look for negative positive shape relationships, or I could also look at what I call drop verticals or horizontals, where if I look at the edge of a part of a drawing, and if I were to do a vertical check, moving up, what does it encounter? What does it come into contact with? If I were to do a horizontal cut, what does it come into contact with? Because it creates this measuring system that helps me stay in scope with the scale that I'm using for the space. Always take a break. So go back to that part. Always make sure that you take a break between drawings. So I wanted to leave enough time in the workshop. Oh, my bad. Let's go back to that. I wanted to leave enough time in the workshop for us to get started. We're not starting yet, but for everyone to kind of get started, to kind of, look at a space in your home or your office where you're at, wherever you're at right now, to kind of start with this basic system of like finding, the basic shapes within the space. Are they cubical? Are they spherical? Do they have a conical quality, a pyramid-like quality? Start with those big forms and then start to look at, what are the diagonals of those forms? And then look at the scale of, how those forms are living amongst one another in the space. Just starting off very, very basic. Like at the very beginning here, you see this, there's a couple of diagonals. Let me go back right here. A couple of diagonals. And this was just kind of taking a guess. This is like, I think it's this diagonal, and then creating a few more marks. I think it's this diagonal and this diagonal. And then I start to explore it. And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I need to change the direction of these diagonals. And then I just continue building, those basic shapes and start to make other references. And those references then become negative positive shape references, vertical horizontal drop checks, maybe a scale check, using a scale system that I created. Like in this case, it was like now the corner of the bed right here, or the lamp shade. And just keep building, taking breaks in between so that you can get a fresh eye and then return to your drawing to look at the mistakes. Another really helpful thing is to use a mirror and to look at the space that you're drawing, and then have your drawing also in view of the mirror, so that you can kind of pick up on some mistakes. It's like having a fresh perspective. Okay. This is the process that we're going to be using for this workshop. And I'm going to do this process live with y'all. So we're going to try to do 2 drawings or 2 sketches in the workshop. We'll see what time permits for this, but I love the philosophy. If you make a whole lot of them, you'll learn it, versus if you try to work on one, perfect one. There's a lot of things to learn in that process, but I love the repetition philosophy, because then I feel like there's more things learned more quickly. So we'll try to make 2 drawings in this workshop, but if we just end up making 1, that's okay. Right, so the process is, we're going to start by looking at the space that we're wanting to draw, or it could be a still life if you prefer to go in a still life direction. But you want to start by finding the basic shapes. Make sure you mark lightly on your drawing surface. And as you're looking for those basic shapes, use like the diagonals, vertical, horizontal checks. Try to find some sort of a measuring unit within those shapes. And then start by trying to get those basic shapes in proportion. No details, no like going in and trying to get all the perfect little curly cues or the perfect like negative positive shape first. We want to make sure this is like building a structure for our drawing, like a playground. And if it has a solid foundation with the shapes being, close in proportion and then in scale with one another, then you're giving yourself a really solid framework to then go in and build more detail. It's a little bit of a patience required in the process, but if you're kind to your future self by doing this stage thoughtfully and patiently, the rest of your drawing comes out very well, because you have all of the scale and the proportions established. Okay. So after we have our basic shapes in place, and it's time to start making some of those subtle adjustments, you could start cutting into them, looking at the negative and positive shapes that you see happening around the main shapes. That's the figure ground. That is like separating the object from the space around it. Take a little break so that you can come back to it with a fresh eye, or you could use a mirror to turn around and look at your drawing and look at the space you're rendering and kind of assess, what you might need to shift, and then revisit little areas. I tend to work in circles, so I'll start in one part of a drawing, and then I will make sure that the basic shapes are in place. I'll try to make sure they're in proportion. I'll try to look at the diagonals, and then as I give myself the basic shapes in my design, I'll start to wander around the drawing and have a little bit more fun. And then build detail within the space you create. So if you're looking at like the corner of your room, you might want to focus a little bit more on a certain area, like maybe there's a stack of books or some flowers or like a pile of mail that you haven't checked, or there might be some parts that you want to include more information of in your drawing and omit other parts. Like as you have your framework for your drawing set up with your shapes, proportions, and basic negative positive shape relationship set up, you can go in and explore any aspect of that space that you want. Okay. I'll go over this next part, but this is about a time where I would say we would almost pause. And if you don't have your drawing station set up, meaning a space in your home or your room or your office, wherever you're at, where you want to work, I would say go ahead and kind of start to situate yourself in a way so that you can do the exercise with me as we're doing it live in class together. Okay. As we start to develop our drawing, we're going to get to a point where we'll start to combine those tools that I was just talking about. This is where it gets really fun. You'll start finding things like shape relationships within your drawing. Like in this drawing, it was just so interesting that there were 4 people. They weren't exactly in these poses, but they were in a similar proximity to each other. And I just thought it was a hilarious like rhythm where they're almost perfectly side by side. Now they weren't sitting in this way. I had to move them in the drawing, but the shape relationship was, I thought it was just so funny. And then there was a triangle that I found between these 3 like coffee cup type things. And that just made me really happy to see that, like that triangle structure, to help establish more of that figure ground with scale, with one of the cups being large and the other 2 cups being small. So that pattern, I didn't really see it until the drawing started to evolve. And then this drawing on the right side here, it's my husband sitting at his desk with his giant monitor, and he's always surrounded by file cabinets of stuff that he's trying to organize. And so he was just in the zone, and I thought, oh, look at that. There's all these like rectangles and cubes going all over the place. And so I tried to draw him roughly, but then I kind of used parts of him as a measuring device to help inlay the structure of the cubes. And so, but he was the main focal point of that design. And then him as a measuring unit kind of started to help me like move outside of that. And so it became this rhythm of like cubicle shapes in his like cubicle type setting at home. Like I was saying a little bit earlier, measuring units mixed with diagonals starts to create that magical dynamic of perspective drawing. Now, we're not going to go over perspective drawing theory, but I do want to give you the tools to practice learning how to see perspective naturally. And 2 of the biggest things that I find that helps when I'm drawing something in perspective are, what are the diagonals? So as I'm using my measuring device or my drawing tool, what are the diagonals of a structure? And then after I find that diagonal, how long is that diagonal? Now I'll have to have established a measuring unit and then use that consistently, because as things get further away in space, they get smaller. And as they get closer to us, they get bigger. But as I'm starting to draw like a cityscape type space, I'll start with like trying to, what are those diagonals? And then as I'm finding them, I'll then decide, okay, which diagonal do I want to have as the main focus in this design? And then I'll use that diagonal as the key measuring unit for the rest of the design. So that's kind of like, when I figured that out with perspective, I was like, well, That makes a lot more sense because regular linear perspective, a lot of times it'll actually distort the space. And so if you're following the principles of regular linear perspective, if you find a couple of the diagonals, you'll find sometimes that other diagonals in your drawing will be so extreme that they'll create this distortion. So this process where you're just looking at finding what your diagonals are and then establishing a measuring unit within the select diagonals you want to use for your drawing, this kind of creates a little bit more of, I think, a natural feel to the drawing. And again, the verticals and the horizontals, when I was making this drawing study of the Co-Creative Center, I kept using lots of vertical horizontal checks. They're kind of faint, difficult to see, but if you look at this very faint line by the leaf, I don't know if you could see my mouse moving right here, but there's all these little vertical lines right here. That's me doing a vertical drop. And what's neat about this tool, vertical and horizontal drops, is it gives you a chance to see a little bit more of a specific shape within the negative positive spaces so that I could see that my other markings are either the right proportion or at the right diagonal or at the right negative positive shape relationship. So like this diagonal that I dropped on the right side of this flower pot right here, I dropped it until it met the surface that it was sitting on. And then I took a look at that triangle that was formed as a result of that vertical drop where it starts to make contact with the form of the flower pot. And so that triangle is what became my information for how to modify the diagonal of the flower pot and also how to modify this little plastic tray that the pot was sitting in. So verticals and horizontals are extremely helpful for like kind of sussing out like if something's slightly too long, it's too high up, too low, too far to the left, too far to the right, or if the shape's not exactly what you're looking for. Vertical horizontals are a really great way to just kind of knock something in place, you know, if it's, you know, moving too far to one side or to the other. And the rest of it is just having fun, just really having fun, just like starting somewhere, like play this video minute, starting somewhere with some basic shapes, you know, and then starting to suss out what the diagonals of those shapes are, creating a measuring unit within the marks that you've already laid down on your drawing, starting to assess what the negative and positive shapes are doing within the marks that you've created, doing some vertical horizontal checks as you're moving along to kind of move things over in place, and then moving around the drawing, like after you've established your a part of the drawing that you feel confident with, that then becomes a part that is like a reference point for you to build the rest of the drawing. Always use the same reference point. A really common mistake, I used to make this mistake all the time, is as we move through our drawing, we'll switch measuring units. We'll start like maybe with a unit of measurement in one part of our drawing, and then as we move towards the end, like when I was starting to build the fan at the very top, I still used the measuring unit down here to figure out how long the fan blades were going to be. Oh, still stay with the same measuring unit that you're working with, okay? Because what will happen is a lot of times artists will use one measuring unit to begin the drawing, and then as it starts to build, they'll find a new happy place to reference, and they'll start using that reference for building the rest of the drawing, and you'll find some inconsistencies in the scaling of your drawing. Now, it's not about it being right or wrong. It's just if you have the goal, which this workshop's kind of centered on, to create as close of a, you know, a capturing of the space in a way that's spatially consistent, it's good to use the same moment in space, the same object as a measuring unit so that everything stays consistent. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start with a little bit of a Q&A if anyone has questions about those vocabulary terms or the process that I went over. And after that, we're going to start, I'm going to have you guys kind of set up a little working space to draw a part of your room or a still life, anything that's in front of you, and to start sussing out those basic shapes. I'm going to be working in the background doing a drawing with you, but I'm going to be actually using, in this case, a photo reference. This is a candid shot I took of some friends out by, you know, the neighborhood bar where everybody goes at the end of the work week and just like catches up on, you know, how things are going in life. So I'm going to use this reference image of a friend's, and I'm going to go through this process with y'all. So I'm going to be looking again at like basic shapes, establishing a measuring unit, looking at diagonals, negative positive shapes that make up the figure ground. And then if we have time, we'll go into the tonal mapping, but I'm going to be doing that drawing over here on this side. So as we're all working, all of us, if there's any questions that you may have, Dina or Kyle are going to field the questions. And so I don't know, Dina, if you want to have them unmute themselves if they have a question, or if you want to read questions from the comment section. But everyone can go ahead and set up their drawing space. And I'll go ahead and take a couple of questions or comments as I'm starting.
We actually have one question in the chat that is about the measuring unit. And can you explain that a little bit further?
Yes.
Thank you.
So measuring unit, so they're talking about, let's see, this component right here. Measuring unit is, first, it's your decision on what you want to decide to create the measuring unit out of. So let's say in this drawing, I wanted the space to be about the umbrella. Let's say it was the umbrella that I really wanted to capture in this. I would look at scopes of the umbrella to give me a sense of what the measuring unit would become. So let's say if I was analyzing this part, well, let me pump up the opacity a bit. Let's say if I was analyzing from here to here, this would then become the measuring unit for my drawing. So if I look at, for example, the length between here and here, you notice how short that is compared to that. So what I could do is look at how many of these fit into this. Or I could say a fraction of how much of this creates this. Now, something that really helps, and I'll actually start working on that drawing over here. I should have made this image just a little bit bigger.
Kat, we had another question. How do you choose which object to use as your measuring unit?
I choose objects based on what will be easy to count 3 or 4 times maximum, and what parts would be easy to cut in half. So I looked at this moment right here because it has a length to it that would be pretty easy for me to use in other parts of the drawing. Another measuring unit I could use is from the top of the table down here. That would be an easy measuring unit, but let me go ahead and actually start showing that. So in recreating this type of a moment, I really want to look at what's going on with the tilt of the umbrella as it starts to cover them. So I'm looking at what's the biggest shape, what are the big shapes? So I haven't gotten to the measuring unit yet because I'm still at the general shape compartment of it. So I'm looking at what are this has got like a triangle quality going on. And there's a bit of an ellipse that's also starting to occur right here. That ellipse kind of starts to move down a little bit further. So the drawing's very messy to begin with. All right, here's a diagonal that I'm looking at right there, this diagonal. So it's kind of, and then here's another diagonal, check that out. So this is a negative positive shape that I'm analyzing the angle of that. So I'm looking at that angle and it's making contact with this diagonal, something like so. And then here's a subtle shift to that diagonal right there. So I'm following that. And then it's making contact. So this is where it will get, there's going to be a lot of erasing. Okay. So now I'm looking at, okay, what are the general, I'm kind of like citing what are the diagonals, and I'm making a very basic shape. Like I'm not getting attached to anything yet. And then there's a continuation of a diagonal right there that I'm finding. And there's a very small shape that's happening right there. Okay. This diagonal, this has a curve to it, but I'm not paying any attention to that. It's just a diagonal that's moving in that direction. So I'm going to kind of erase this and start to look at capturing bits of that diagonal right there. Okay. So now I'm seeing that this part of the ellipse down here was too far up. So I'm going to go back and erase that. And now I've got this is where vertical horizontals come into play. Check out this moment right here. Look at where it intersects with that part of the umbrella. It's about roughly right there, right? So I'm just kind of going down in that direction, and then I'm looking and I'm observing a bit of that diagonal. That's a part of an ellipse that's happening right here. So I can start to suss out what those diagonals are and also be mindful that they're following that tendency of the ellipse right there, like so. Okay, so the drawing looks really messy at first. So remember the beginning of this drawing, how there's like these very basic shapes that, you know, as you start to build it, it's not about the detail first, it's about just getting those basic proportions in place. So I'm generally okay with where the umbrella is at now because it's got enough of a mass to it, a shape and a mass and general proportion that I can start to move on. So in this case, I'll probably use something like, I'm going to change colors really quick so you can see. I'd probably use something like this as a part of a measuring unit because I'm getting ready to go down with this pole right here. I'm doing a vertical horizontal check to see where that pole is living in relationship to the top of the umbrella. And it looks like the pole's ever so slightly to the left. So it's coming about right here. And then there's a diagonal. Now my diagonal initially was a little too steep. So now I'm gonna go for it again. Now I just looked at the direction of my diagonal. Now I've got to measure it. So this measuring unit right here, if I look at how many of these fits here, that's what I mean by measuring unit. So this is shorter compared to the stem of the umbrella. And so if I take a look and I measure it, it looks like this kind of goes from here to about right here. And then I look at how much is left over, and I could continue all the way down to the ground if I want. It's probably a good idea because it'll help me with another measuring component later. But I can look and see that there's roughly one, almost a little bit more than two of these. So as I'm making this diagonal direction over here, let's go back to blue. You can see that there's one, almost two right there. I'm missing drawing, there we go. All right. And so now I'm going to continue to use this as a measuring unit. So let's see, what else would we want to capture next? I really love the table. The table creates a nice solid structure. So now it's kind of going to be about combining measuring unit and basic shape, because check out the shape that's happening right here. This is a square, basically. It's got a parallelogram quality to it, but it's basically like a square. And I can look at things like vertical, horizontal drops to kind of figure out how long this space is, or I can look at negative positive shapes. And that's where the tools kind of start to become, you know, you use them in a way that whatever seems most helpful. So to expedite it, I'd probably start by just looking at that basic diagonal of the table, like sizing the diagonal up, or not sizing it, but like looking at the degree of the diagonal and just going in that direction. So I would say maybe something like right here, and it's moving slightly up because it's below the eye level. And doing a vertical horizontal check, I can see that it's slightly outside of the umbrella right there. So I'm doing this diagonal and then I'm landing slightly outside of the umbrella right there. See how I did that? Again, this is still in the basic shape part, very basic shape build up. Okay. So here's another chance to look at diagonals right here. Boom. And now I could, if I don't use the measuring component, when I make moments like this and I don't measure properly, I could make the table too wide, you know, or make the table too narrow. And so this is where going back to like use the original measuring unit as best as you can. So as I'm looking at this little component right here, I'm kind of seeing that it could fit into this space almost roughly 3 times. And so that means like roughly a third of this is of the length of that diagonal right there. And then I get a chance, and I'm going in this direction of kind of assessing what's the next diagonal, which I'm going to go with its parallel to the first one. Now, again, these are general shapes that are going to be cleaned up. So remember right here where there was these assessments of, let's see if I can play this part again. There was the assessments of, you know, the diagonals changing. There's this really messy part right here where I'm looking at where is this diagonal going, where is this diagonal going, where is this diagonal going, and I keep shifting and changing, making a lot of adjustments to the general shapes before I start going into any of those details. And so I'm doing that right here.
Kat, we had a question. How do you choose which object to start drawing?
I try to go for the biggest objects first that I find interesting. It can be easily deduced into one of those three shapes: circle, triangle, square. And so in this case, I found a cone that I really liked out of the umbrella. So I went for the umbrella first. And I think it's a general enough shape to begin with, where if I get the general proportions right, then I could use parts of that as measuring units and reference points to start building out the drawing. I work kind of in a similar fashion to Lucian Freud used to, but Freud wasn't so concerned about measuring units, but he would be known for like starting in one place in his painting and kind of sprawling out from there. But he would kind of throw out measuring units entirely. Like he'd be a little bit more like first instinctive reaction when it came to measuring units. Whereas when I'm starting a drawing, I'll start in a general place, but I'll look for those big shapes. I'll look for, you know, is this something that could be broken down into simpler measuring units that I could use for other parts of the space? Like I wouldn't start with a figure. Like she has like a good shape going on with her, but she's made of more complex shapes. So if I try to use her as a general measuring basic shape and diagonal device, there's going to be so many variations to figure out within her that what happens is the rest of the space is going to probably end up being negated because she's, you know, taking up all of that energy. And that's kind of like going in the more the direction of like in figure drawing. When I'm looking at spaces and drawing spaces, the figures a lot of time become secondary. Like they sit in the space, but it's not about them. So like there's figures in these spaces, but the figures have been deduced down to basic shape and proportion so that what I could do is go back. And if I wanted to put a figure in there, I have the information I need to be able to plant them in a way that is in perspective and to scale. This one right here, the same thing. You look at these figures, they were planted into the space after the diagonals, after the measuring unit, after all of these big shapes were figured out. They were kind of placed in a way so that they fit like a jigsaw puzzle, which is different from if you're starting off with like figure drawing where the focus is about the figure and then the space is a secondary element. I kind of go in the reverse direction in this case. Like I love working with the portraiture and full figure pieces, but space, what I find so gratifying about working from looking at the spatial approach is you kind of create this moment that has a lot of these contextual clues of what was happening at that time. It feels a little bit more like time-based as far as giving more contextual information.
There was another question: when you're working from life, how do you frame the room and create a composition?
I could actually put an image I found. This was an old grad school. This was like an hour-long figure drawing session. So it was a quick study. Let me see, I'll pull it up and show you so you can see. So what I did was I went for the diagonals first. And after I found the diagonals of a room, then I started to look at, well, how long are those diagonals? And where do I cut off the length of those diagonals so that they start to frame, like the frame of the space of where the figure is going to live. And the figure actually ended up being a bit of an afterthought. Now this was again, this was like a quick 1 hour sketch. Okay, so in this drawing, I was hunting for these relationships first. The figure is there, but the figure is living in a space. And so I would go hunting for these diagonals in the space. Here's a vertical, actually the vertical of the room would be there, place that. Here's a diagonal of like an easel that somebody was drawing on. I put bunny ears on them. Right there, you can see a rough gesture of their arm and their head. There's their jawline, the skull, right there in the nose. I put little bunny ears on them. Here's diagonals of another structure that was right behind the model. So when I'm approaching a figure and trying to think about the figure in space, let me actually turn this off. Even without seeing the rest of the drawing, you could see how, like, sussing out the nature of these basic large diagonal relationships, you start to see a bit of a space that's created. And what's really neat about finding these diagonals, like let's take a look at the diagonals in this piece right here. So we've got this diagonal, there's this diagonal to the table, we have diagonals going on to the seats of the table. Let's see, what else do we have? We have some verticals going on for the fence. So I'm just going to capture a few of the verticals and the diagonals. And what I want you to see is look at how the space already starts to form because of capturing, follow that back there, do a couple more. Look at how the space already starts to show itself with how the diagonals are talking to each other. Let me take those parts out of the way. By looking, it's like looking for the major foundational clues. This makes me think about like the bass player in a band. Like you don't necessarily always hear what they're doing, but you can hear that subtle foundation that they're helping to maintain between the rhythm and the chord structures of what's going on in a musical piece. So I look at those diagonals within a space and then the length of them, and I try to look at the relationships they start to establish to help model a space that when I start to draw a figure or a still life object, I can use those other tools like the negative positive shapes between their form and the diagonals. I could use basic shapes that they're creating and how those basic shapes to scale are living inside of that space made by those diagonals. And so it's kind of like, it's creating this measuring unit. It's also creating the design of a piece. Like if I were to, let's say, only focus on this element right here of the table. Right there. That is a totally different design compared to, like, if I were to, let's say if this was about, let's go here and just include enough of their bust. The space in this image right here is very different. There's going to be actually a lot more negative positive shape relationships going on in here because there's some diagonals happening, like this blue diagonal running through here and here. But in this case, it becomes a little bit more about basic shape and negative positive shape hunting in a way, if that makes sense. Negative and positive shape in this case, like if you take a look at what this space is doing in between the forms of the figures, or you could look at, there's the, change different color. There's the space that's happening if we were to group them together. Now I'm going to turn off the reference again. This is a very different approach. I would look at this more with the measuring unit and basic shapes. There'd be some of the diagonals that would assist with this, but with this composition being much more organic compared to this composition here with lots of diagonals, that are leading to a horizon line that's outside of that particular scope right there. That would be a different approach. So again, these tools, they help, they're kind of like, think of like a hammer and a screwdriver and a crowbar, and you use tools for different things depending on what action needs to be accomplished. So when I'm looking at a space, if it's a space that feels much more organic, I'll use like negative positive shape assessment, vertical horizontal checks, scaling with the basic shapes that I found. If it's a space that has a lot of like diagonals, like the corner of a room, the desk-like structures in a space, I'll take the same approach, but I'll pay more attention at first to those diagonals and create a measuring unit from the diagonals, as opposed to like making a measuring unit out of the like negative positive shapes and form combinations. Does that make sense?
How do you apply these rules to drawing portraits?
That's a different workshop, I would say. Yeah, that's probably, there's similar ways to use these measuring devices like negative positive shape, general shape makeup, and like scale. But
Mhm.
I would say that's material for a different workshop because that's a different kind of a different world. I'd recommend looking at Riley. There's a Riley method to portraiture, and the Riley method uses a lot of basic shape breakdown for anatomy. But with
How do you
portrait,
spell that? I'll put it in the chat. Riley.
Railly.
Okay.
In this case, I would recommend, if you're drawing people, to draw them in a basic shape way so that they fit into the space that you're creating for them to fit together. So it's not about drawing the figure and then drawing the space around the figure. In this case, in this workshop, you look at those basic relationships in the space. So like the diagonals, the length of the diagonals, or the nature of the basic shape and what that shape is made of, negative positive shape relationships, and then using other tools like vertical horizontal checks, measuring units, and then kind of rechecking different parts of your drawing while going back to the initial measuring unit that you used at the very beginning. This workshop's kind of focused on creating that practice so that you kind of have these tools in hand to be able to capture, I don't want to call it the natural perspective, but you capture the scope of a space, and it feels like a space that you could kind of walk into because the scaling of objects is consistent. Like as they get closer, they get bigger. As they get further away, they get smaller. The diagonals of surfaces don't seem like they're wobbling off like a table. That if you have like a drink on a table, but the diagonal is off, it feels like it's going to fall off the table. So in this case, in a room setting, you'll want to try to find like the diagonals of maybe the top where the wall meets the ceiling, or maybe the top of a door somewhere, or maybe some tables or shelves or any sort of a boxy-like structure that's in the space. And for the organic shapes, like the plants that I was drawing in the Co-Creative Center, I'll use like, start with basic shapes, create a measuring unit out of that. And then I'll do like some vertical horizontal checks as the drawing's developing. Let me go back to that. So in this case, in the drawing, there's the vertical drops that I would do. And then I would look at the negative shape that forms as a result of that negative space that happens right there. And then I would look at the space that I'm drawing and I would see, does it kind of match up with what I have going on in the drawing itself? Now, of course, it's not about, getting things accurate as much as creating a bit of a consistency with those properties of shape, scale, diagonal, negative, positive shapes that create a sense of a space that one could enter. So I'm going to share screen and continue to work on the piece in the background. And what we can do is continue working for, I'd say maybe 10 minutes perhaps, and then take a look. And if anyone has questions, or if they want to kind of hold their drawing up to the screen or something, like they want to get a little bit of review on it, like what I'm doing right now, we can get some feedback in there. That would be actually great to see, because then it'll help me understand a little bit more of what material to go over more so. But if you have any questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat section, and Dina or Kyle can let me know. Use smaller marks so that the drawing has more room to breathe. And I'm also going to kind of talk out loud, if that's okay, as I'm building it, so that y'all can hear my process. I just noticed something. The space here is smaller than the space I have here. So my negative positive shape assessment here is telling me that this is off. So I'm going back to my tools and figuring out which one of these tools can help me correct that. And I think what's going to happen is it's going to be about the diagonals in this case, which means that the picnic table diagonal is not correct. So I'm going to kind of get rid of that and move that up just a little bit more. There we go. That's too far up. It's a little bit better. So I was adjusting this diagonal because I was looking at this negative space right here. And I'm noticing that in that negative space in the reference, you know, this is a little bit closer in proportion than where the diagonal was at earlier, which was somewhere down here. So that's what I mean by, you know, you have different ways that we could use these tools. And whenever we have some sort of a dilemma that we're trying to revisit, these are the tools that help me most often figure out which part of the drawing I need to reapproach and correct a bit. So I'm going to continue working on this. This is actually a great opportunity to also talk about figure in a way. So let's see, I'm going to bring this down just a little bit more before I start that. Okay, so let's see if I can erase that. There we go, so you can see her. So if I look at the figure, there's this negative space above her head in the umbrella. And then remember this measuring unit that I was using before? I'm going to use this space to figure out how many times it fits into my measuring unit right here. So it looks like it fits about that many times. So I'm looking at this part in that distance. I'm also going to do another like vertical drop to figure out where does her head live in relationship to the umbrella. So it looks like it's living somewhere closer to here. And then there's about this much space before the head starts. And so I have an idea that the top of her head begins right here. Do y'all see how I did that? Does anyone have questions of how I did that? Now, I haven't drawn her head yet. This is just me figuring out where the top of her head is roughly going to live. Okay, so I'll keep going. So now I've got.
Can you show it again, please?
Yeah, so so I'm going to get rid of these reference moments. So I want to put her into the space. In fact, I kind of want to make the whole design about her because she would create this really cool design, like this L shape that she's doing and the table with that. Like, I really like that design. So I'm going to kind of start to make it about her. So I've got to figure out where she lives in this space. So I did an assessment of how far away is the top of her head from where the umbrella is. So I'm looking at this right here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's a measuring component. So now I go back to my measuring unit and I figure out how many of these fits to these, right? So it's about that much.
So I have another question. How do you, when you say you figure it out, do you kind of eyeball it, like you figuring out there's like four of these measurements? How do you do that? That's the mystery part.
Okay, so I start with the general measuring unit and a basic shape. So I kind of just wing it at first. I'm like, you know, try to find basic shape properties, you know, suss things out. It's like making a hypothesis for a science experiment. I'm like, I think this is what's happening. And then I start to assess my hypothesis. So in this case, the diagonal is a lot steeper, so it's got to actually go out further, right? And I've got like this diagonal here, which seems pretty on point. And then I've got things like a measuring unit, like does this distance make sense with the proportion of this like part of the triangle, for example? So I start hunting for these general relationships first. Or if I just look for this entire triangle, I'm gonna use a different color. I just start looking for this general relationship right here. Check out that triangle. And I look, I'm like, did I arrive at a similar shape? And so there's a bit of eyeballing, but there's also, the eyeballing is me looking at diagonals, looking at the measuring, like how long are different parts of the diagonals. I'm looking at the shapes, okay? I haven't done the figure ground yet because in this case, this is just right here looking at the shape, the length of each part of the shape, and the degree of the diagonals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. I love this. I started making, like, I started the art world when I was 24, and I always thought it was magic that people did. And I love the art so much. And so I made it a point to try to, I took a more scientific method to a lot of my practice. Like, okay, if we try this, what are the results? How did we get there? Can we work backwards from that and make more variations in control? Like, I've always been very methodical. And so the practice I developed kind of comes from that part of my personality where I'm like, what's the formula? And it's not a formula that you use exactly as is throughout. It's just kind of like this, like, what are some tools that I could quickly refer to so that I could have more room for the creative part? Like I was just saying, we found a cool composition right here of the woman, you know, the way she's sitting. So we'll make a cool design from that. And I couldn't have gotten to that part of the design if I didn't have these tools at my disposal of like, find the basic shapes, use a measuring unit within those shapes to figure out the proportion of the shapes and the subtleties of those shapes with the negative positive shapes, and find the degree of those diagonals. So it's like almost like drafting, you know, at the beginning where you're like making this framework for yourself to play inside of. So I'm going to continue working on that framework a little bit more, and then I'm going to start having a little bit more fun. All right, so her head's here, and it's about this length of that. So I'm going to do that quick vertical drop again. Oops, wrong color. Okay, so I'm going to do that quick vertical drop, and the top of her head looks like it's starting about here. Now that's where I'm looking. Now the bottom of her head, if we start doing things like, now here's where it gets really fun. We do like a horizontal check, the bottom of her head right here. And if I were to do a horizontal check, I'm going to do this on a totally different layer so you can see this. If we were to do a horizontal check from the bottom of her chin to the end of the umbrella and turn all these other things off, you see that right there. So now I'm looking at, what is this triangle? I know it seems kind of like silly and like more in the geometry world, but like that's negative. That's a negative shape that I'm looking at, and it's also, it's a basic shape, and it's also a measuring unit. So the same lady who asked that question, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually mind-boggling that you
works.
see it that way. Thank you.
It
I
works
would
every
never
time.
make the connection in that triangle there. I would use like existing shapes, and this is so interesting.
Oh,
Thank
you
you.
could do anything you want, anything you want. Like it
Yeah,
doesn't
no,
have to
but
be a
this is very
triangle.
helpful.
It could be
Yeah, yeah.
like it could be like instead, it could be this moment. Like I'm gonna make something yellow. Like everybody works in different ways, and that's what's so cool about teaching. You give them, you like, you show what you know, like a scientist, you show the research, and then you see what people do with it. Like check out this square right here. So this square gives me this frame of reference proportionally of where their cute faces are supposed to live in the space, right? So I'm going, I happen to move in that triangle direction because I have a habit of looking at diagonals a lot. So I tend to default to triangles. That's just my personality. But you could use any tool you want to use for this. But yeah, the basic shape
Thank you.
reference, measuring unit, diagonals, they work like a charm. They're like a best friend to save the day when you just don't know what to do next. And you're like, well, let's go back to the measuring. Let's go look at those diagonals. Okay, so her head is a tiny bit bigger than the space above her head. It's a tiny bit longer. So I'm looking at this space, and again, like the fun measuring part is just going to say, okay, her head stops there vertically. So that's this distance, but now I got to figure out where it lives here side to side. So I do a drop vertical. It kind of hits that part of the umbrella right there. It's right here. So it looks like her head's going to live here. And then the back of her head, the farthest back, looks like it's going to live somewhere here. So check it out. Now I have a box to carve a space of a head. You know, now this is a square, it's not a box. You know, we could go into a little bit of perspective and take a look at what her nose is doing, take a look at her jawline, take a look at her cool hair, what she's got going on, but we can't get into the details yet. We're still building the space. Just that's what's so fun about this process, is like you're building a whole moment, not just and portraits. I love making portraits and I love figures. I love painting them, but it's just something about capturing essence of a moment and being able to stylize it, that it just has its own different set of rewards that happen. So, okay, we've got a head, it's a measuring unit. So now this is kind of where, like, I would say going into figure ground, like negative, positive shapes with basic shapes and measuring units kind of start to play together, to dance together. So, but I got to also kind of behave myself and not let myself get too out of whack. Like if I just do this, there's no sense of measuring that happens. Like I could start to place her figure there, but there was no, what I call like responsible measuring. So I'm looking at a part of her that, like, you know, where does she live right here in relationship to that diagonal we found? Remember that? Where is she living at? So she's roughly here. And so then I do a vertical check here and it lines up right about there. So that means that on this component, and then I have this diagonal here that I could also check. Like there's this diagonal. So if I look at the essence of that diagonal and then where her outer extreme, the elbow goes, I can do this. And it's very minimal, but it starts to get, all of a sudden we have a sense of perspective of her arm moving away from us. Like, check it out, pretty cool. Oh, but check it out, it's also, it's not, there's a problem with the table, because look at this. The table's down here, her elbow's up here, her elbow's sitting on the table. So you see that thing that happened? No measuring. So there was some aspect of the diagonal, but not enough of a measuring into place. So what probably is going on is her head might not be big enough, because if we look at the proportion I made from the arm, upper arm to the elbow to the hand, that makes sense with the head, but then there's this space down here that's missing. So again, that's why it's so important to take these very basic measuring steps seriously. And this is like what I was talking about when I was saying, be kind to your future self. Because I mean, does anybody else ever have that sensation where you're building a drawing and you like where it's going and then you decide to stop measuring and parts of the drawing stop making sense with other parts of the drawing, and you're like, oh no, oh no, oh no, 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 like the TikTok sound, you know? So I'm gonna reassess a little bit. It looks like this part might need to be a little bit longer. And then the head,
Is
go ahead.
Is there any way you could make the photo a little bit larger? Someone was asking.
Oh, yes. There's a reason I have it small. The reason I have it small is because I don't want people to think that it turns into an exercise of copying the photo. So I'm making it very minimal so that all you get to see are basic shape relationships, right? Like if you make it big and available, it gets really tempting to jump into those juicy details. Really tempting. But so I have it at the scale that it's currently at so that we don't see that yet. I will make it big. I'll promise to make it big later on. Remind me to make it big again. We'll stick to the smaller scale for now, and I'll go ahead and plant the female figure in there. And then we'll make it big and we'll kind of compare notes to it, okay? I'll go ahead and just continue. So her head's about a little bit bigger, and I'm also looking at the bottom of her head and where it makes contact with the table and taking that into account. This part of the table may actually be a little bit too wide. So this is me going back and changing a scope of the width of that table. That diagonal's off. There we go, it's a little bit better. Okay, so, right, so we're gonna put her head, let's see, her hand makes contact, her elbow makes contact with the table roughly right here. And then there's a rough diagonal happening there with a shoulder and a basic shape of the head starting to live, come on cat, right here. So her head is living in this space right here. Now it's tilted away from us. So this egg shape I made is not in perspective properly. I should probably do that the right way to kind of show what her face is doing. She's kind of taking a hard twist right there. Her head. So I'll kind of just reference that. Again, basic shapes. I'm just using the basic egg shape for the figurehead. Okay. And now I'm going to kind of look at the basic shape of what her torso is doing and kind of continue to build. And that I'll be quiet for a second so actually I can focus a little bit easier. There's a really neat diagonal right here, but I don't know if I want that in the design because that starts to interfere with the design. I'm talking about the diagonal that's kind of going into her like that. And I don't think I want to have that in the design. It kind of creates this cool zigzag effect, but that's not the zigzag I'm looking at. I'm kind of looking more at this neat zigzag that's coming from her form. And I'm looking now at like a basic shape that her torso is making. So it's this funky, like organic part of a parallelogram at the bottom, but then it kind of goes into an organic direction near the top. So looking there, and I'm also looking at this relationship of shapes right here. So from her meeting contact with the table and looking at how that changes. So that creates a little bit of this. There's a vertical drop for where her head comes down. Another one for like where her elbow comes down. So again, I'm just sussing out these general dynamics. There's a cool negative space where her torso is that her arms are framing that I think looks really cool that I could maybe play with, but I can't let myself get too much into details yet. She does have a little bit more of the lean that she's doing. So, you know, this part of the arm is going to go a little bit further down. I think I'll end up having to raise the table a little bit more. So you're hearing me talk out loud with this process. I know I said I was going to be quiet a second ago, but I just want you to hear my thoughts as I'm building this drawing. And again, I'm not even going into details yet. I'm still looking at the basic shapes. So this vertical drop we did earlier from the elbow, the knee looks like it exists right here, close to it. Now, check out how this space is starting to interfere with the umbrella. Like this space is a little bit smaller. So I had to be mindful not to let the body get too big. I got to keep that basic proportion in check. So I'm going to just follow the lead on what's going on here. There's a cool diagonal of the foot going right here, but it's, again, that umbrella diagonal starting to break contact with that. So it means that a part of my drawing of her is too big. Bit of a perfectionist and kind of start again, because that's practice. Okay. So as I'm doing this kind of in the background, as you're looking at your space and you're analyzing these shape relationships, just like I am, it's very common to make an assumption of what you think is happening as far as the scale of the shape you drew, or the diagonal that you drew, or the specific silhouette of the shape. Like there's all these assumptions we make when we draw. And what's so cool is going back and looking at the relationships that you created as a result of going back and reassessing, you know, what those assumed observations were. So what I'm going to do is try to create a boundary. So the umbrella lives here and the leg lives here. So I'm going to take a different approach. This is also me looking at negative positive shape relationships. So in figure drawing, there's a thing called gesture drawing. I am not looking at that approach right now because I'm looking at how do these main shapes kind of fit together like a puzzle to create this moment, right? So I found that mistake right there, got it. And if it works, this should start to show a little bit more of how the figure is just kind of sitting in space as opposed to a stiff, like you'll see, like whenever people are drawing figures, there'll be like a formulaic process sometimes, and that works to kind of get a bit of a gesture. But looking at these negative positive shape relationships and simplifying them, I think helps to create a little bit more of a unity between the objects or the figures or whatever that you're drawing in this space with the structures that, you know, that they're encompassing. Helps to create a little bit more of that story. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick assessment of the diagonal from her head down to her foot. So I'm looking at the nature of that diagonal, and it's living something like this. So y'all see how this diagonal is parallel to that diagonal? That's the goal. So by citing that relationship, go back to this, we'll keep on. By citing that relationship, I'm telling myself the tip of the toe is moving, is right here, basically. Now I'm taking a stab at the scale of the foot that I'm drawing, and I'm just making a very basic assessment of the foot in space, but I kind of have an idea of where the end of it lives, like the very far point of where it's going to live, in a way. So now I can, this is where I can start kind of dancing a little bit in the drawing. There's some fun fabric from the pants that she's wearing. And then I can do another assessment, a bit of contour that's capturing the form of part of her leg. Okay, so let me take that diagonal off. And so let's see if this, take away that red mark there. I wonder where those dots came from. Okay, so you see how there's, get rid of that. See how there's a really cool sense of a shape design that's starting to evolve from all of this information right here? I could keep adding to it, and I could add to it based on what this design is doing. So this is kind of going into the framing component. And so I'm going to use a different color so you can see that. So there's this really neat thing that's happening where we have large shape that's like triangular with a bit of a cone. You've got a stem. You've got this really neat plank that's happening. And you've got this like almost this S curvy like moment that's happening. So if I turn this off, like you want to look at the basic shapes of your design. Now, there's a lot happening in this reference image, but what's so neat about drawing, you know, the space around you, the space in front of you, you get to omit and include whatever you want. And you get to be picky on what you're going to include. And this is kind of looking at, and this drawing is kind of starting to turn into a bit of like a motif. You know, the table's not necessarily finished. She's not really finished, but the figure's there. And based on the shape of the figure, you can get a sense that they're sitting down. And there's a bit of a liveliness from the diagonal. Diagonals tend to create a sense of movement and more dynamic as opposed to just working with like dry verticals and horizontals in the design. So it creates a sense of space. And that's what's really neat about this process is like you do with it what you'd like, and you have fun along the way. You be kind to yourself in the beginning by giving yourself those foundational basic shapes, you know, and be patient to adjust the diagonals, the measuring units, the personality of the negative positive shape relationships. It's like it kind of turns into a carving project or a modeling project. And that's where the artist in you comes out, where you're like, well, what are you fascinated in capturing? What kind of things do you might see something in your drawing that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to really appreciate or pick up on because there's so many other things in front of you. Like, let's say if you're working, observing what's on your table, and there's a lot of stuff, but you decide to start just drawing the spherical objects or the conical objects, or you look for objects that are more funky in their shapes and you omit everything else. You know, that's what's so neat about this process. So see, it's 6:30. Does anyone have any pieces they want to share or want some feedback on anything? Or have any questions?
Well, I have a question. So I still find it difficult how to relate everything when you're doing it live. So now you're showing from the picture, you know, you can think in a mind, that this is how the diagonal forms. But when you're actually doing it live, and especially when the objects are moving, so how do you make that relationship?
When you're working from life, it's good to have people sit still as long as you can, or try to work from observing people who are not moving as much. Like a lot of times artists will practice with, if they're in a public like transportation situation, or at a restaurant, or at a cafe, in the doctor's office, a place where you find people sitting still. If that's working with moving animate objects. If it's just working in a space that's inanimate, like in your home, then you don't have to worry so much about that. The reason I was working from a reference is because I didn't have like a camera set up to, do the drawing from life. But the video that I showed that had that little bit of an animated stage by stage process, that was me drawing from an easel in front of the bed and, the lamp in my room, drawing from life. So I always recommend, if you work from life, your diagonals are not as aggressive as when working from photo. Photo lenses tend to create much more extreme diagonals, whereas when you're working from life, the diagonals are a little bit, they're not as deep of a diagonal. But when it comes to working with drawing figures, or trying to break figures up into working from life, I would say break them into basic shapes, and that part takes more practice. I try to find a sense of a measuring component, like the main part of the figure that I'm seeing. It could be a part of their torso, it could be their head. If they're doing a gesture, like have their arm hanging over a chair, it could use a bit of their limb as a measuring unit. But that takes practice. Did that answer the question, Shireen?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kat.
I have a question. If you are working from, like if you're sitting and you see people and you just decide to start drawing them, would you see a problem with maybe taking pictures also? And use those reference pictures also when you're finishing the drawing?
If you know them, no. If I knew both of those people, they're friends of mine. If you know them, no. If you don't, that begs a question of how confident, comfortable you feel. There's some people that might approach people, but then once the person's approached, they realize they're the subject of a study, so then their body language changes aggressively. There's candid photography, which is a whole field like photojournalism, where it's like catching aspects of a moment. So you kind of have to figure out, what you want to do. I always think if it's, let me show an example of a drawing. So I used to frequent cafes more before COVID happened. And I started to, and then COVID's starting to happen again. What I'll do when I'm in a public space, I'll try to create little studies. Like this is a study that I did from a cafe, and all of the hatch marks are basically me refinding the diagonals, like the diagonals are off. And you could see like these hairy hash marks that are look like the figures, and check out how basic the shapes are of them. This guy over here kept moving and moving, and he was driving me a little bonkers, but I loved how he was placed, where he was placed, because I kept seeing like these two figures almost like little eyeballs, and this little basket that had my food in it at the time. I just loved this triangle that was going on between them. And so and then check out the scribbles. You see that, how the scribbles, they don't really suss out what the shape exactly is. It just kind of creates a bit of a moment that captures that there was a shape there, and it was roughly this size, and it was generally going in this direction. And then it starts to become this relationship with those. Like, check out that ellipse. That's like a football ellipse. Like if you were in drawing class, we'd be talking about not making football ellipses. And you could see that the base of this, that the flowers are sitting in, are kind of wonky. But this was like a candid sketch where I was trying to grab people, and it was like following diagonals, looking at measuring units, looking at how things lived in the vertical and horizontal relationships. Here's one that's a lot more simpler. I was at a cafe, and there was this really cool rhythm. There was 3 people sitting here on like little chair couches, and then there were these 3 people sitting on a higher table. And what I thought was really neat is there was an ellipse between these 3 people facing each other, and there was a wider ellipse of these 3 people facing each other. And then there was this rough shape that was kind of like a countertop that separated them. But you see how minimal that is? That's kind of like, I don't know who asked the question, but if you don't feel comfortable grabbing a photo, or you don't, if you want to draw on the spot, I would say break it into shapes again and just look for these really cool patterns, like really cool, like whatever it is that grabs your attention. Like what kind of things do you find you're drawn to?
I could just be sitting, and then I'll be, just watching people, and then something will interest me. It's not necessarily, like I love to draw people or dogs or trees or anything like that. It's just if I see something and it's like a photo moment, if I had a camera, and I'll be like, oh gosh, I need to draw that.
Yeah.
But then, like you said, because it's moving, you sort of lose that, thing that you saw.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. There's these really cool moments. I was saying goodbye to a friend today. He was wearing green glasses, and he was right in front of these two stoplights where the light was green, and there was a green car driving by. And I was like, oh, are you kidding me? That's a perfect moment. Painter in me was like the color green and how it was splattered all over that frame. And when I'm in a space trying to capture an object, a person, I pulled this drawing up. This is a really loose sketch. Like I saw two people having a conversation, and this lady, I don't know what was going on, but she wasn't too happy. And then the body language of this person kept doing some really interesting things, but I couldn't capture the detail of the anatomy. So I went for the negative positive shape approach. I tried my best to like grab what is the shape of what they're doing. Like there's little bits of their arms. They were holding their arms together, like the closed off position. And then this lady was sitting in a chair that was like a much darker, solid colored chair than the clothes that she was wearing. So I used negative positive shapes to kind of frame her within that chair. And then they're held together. The moment was kind of held together with the ellipse of the table between them. And then this was an issue of framing. Like I wanted it to be about them. So I didn't include a lot of space above. But look at how like messy this sketch is. Like this was like, probably a couple minutes of a sketch, really trying as fast as I could to capture the main idea. And that's where it kind of goes back to this, like the main idea. This is what you go hunting for. What are the basic shapes? We got ellipse. We've got this funky negative shape going on right here. We've got an ellipse for the face, like a bit of a square with some triangle action for the shoulders. There's some cylinders. What's the measuring unit and the diagonals, the figure ground. So I would just look at that and try to grab it. Let me find another one. Yeah, because you're not going to make pretty perfect sketches in the process of doing these exercises, the first time, the second time. Like it's a matter of sitting still long enough to build them. Like this was a sketch that I did. There's a couple, I was watching an episode of like 30 Rock or something in the background, and my foot was broken. I had just broken my foot. I was having too much fun dancing and I broke my foot. So I was just kind of on the couch and drawing my living room, and I had my desk set up. This is when we went to teaching online in the fall. So this was kind of like my office over here to the left, but look at how messy the diagonals are, and look at how kind of rough the mark making is. There's a sense of consistency because I was trying to be very strict with my measuring units. I was trying to be as strict as I could with the diagonal components, and I let the space kind of build, making one mark at a time, and then looking at the properties of that mark. Is it the right direction of diagonal? Is it the right length or width? Is it going in the right direction vertically or horizontally? And I just kind of let the piece like build in itself. This was a candid drawing that I did that turned into a painting. And this is a much smaller drawing than what it looks like. This is with charcoal on newsprint. But look how messy it is. And look at those, like it was all basic shapes. I love the triangle of this guy's arm. And then there's this coffee cup right there that just has a sleeve that's kind of sticking into the coffee cup. And there's this lady in the background that she stayed there for a while. She's on the phone. The phone's not visible, but I just thought it was really neat to see the triangle of her arm and the triangle of his arm. And they're kind of facing each other, but they have nothing to do with each other. And so I had to rely on a sense of scale, like the shape of his head, rough circle, in the shape of her head being a smaller circle to help give that sense of space. And there was also a tiny little face that was kind of snuck inside on the top of his arm. And the sense of scale, you know, I was hoping kind of showed that that figure was further away. But it's important to have fun. It's really important because then you kind of let your mind, you know, go in whatever direction you want. Here's another example. So this one I was using a micron pen, and this was in a coffee house. And so this one was really neat because this is on Purchase Street in downtown New Bedford. And right outside the coffee house has big windows. There was a lady who was putting a painting mural, like a window paint, on a shop across the street, and it was the Christmas season. So I just tried to loosely gesture her and then give a scope of space by looking at how small she is compared to what this person is doing. And look how like messy that is, you know? So I've got my horizontals, I've got some diagonals going on. There's a rough assessment of a shape, you know? Go ahead, what was that?
Kat, there is a question in the chat about what you're using to draw on the computer or iPad.
Oh, I'm using Photoshop, and I have an old Wacom tablet that I'm currently using right now. I'm getting ready to switch over to a Cintiq, but I haven't made the switch yet. So I'm just working with this older Wacom. It's, I think the model is, it's the Intuos Pro. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And you can get them in a small size, a medium, or a large size. And I use it to make, like, it saved me when we started doing online teaching. I was using it to make my deliverables, do the demos in class. I've also used it for industry work before. I've used it for animation. It's a really great tablet.
Kat, I have a question again.
Yeah.
So that green bean 2019 picture which you opened, the COVID cafe. So in this, like, I have a question related to framing. So I can see that a lot of space had been taken up by the table, like your table and that little stack in the between.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your idea? Like, did it happen like that, or you wanted that lot of space to be taken up by that empty table? Like, I'm trying to understand how the framing thinking was going on.
Okay, so this one was about two things that I was kind of going after. There was a shape play that I found fascinating between my basket and the two figures that almost made a face that I thought was interesting. So that was a shape component to the design. And then the other thing that I was really interested in is how could I convey a sense of depth using a bit of scale. And so the table, I put the table in place to and I actually exaggerated the size of the table just a little bit to kind of show how much closer we are to this basket on the bottom compared to how further away the figures were. And they're only like a few feet from the table, like maybe say like 5 or 6 feet from the table. But that really big component of the table right there, the biggest challenge with that was making sure the diagonals made sense. I don't know if you can see the erasure marks. Like there's one right here that's moving down like this. And I kept hunting for the right diagonal to kind of make it so that the basket could sit on the table, as well as try to make the table bigger than what it was to help exaggerate how much closer the basket and the table were to us compared to the figures. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But then how do you determine, right? Like, I know you're sitting on the chair and then you have to kind of figure out from which, at what part of the table I should start drawing. I think it comes from practice, so that's kind of mystery.
Oh, okay. So like I was doing in the demo here, you start with something you find fascinating. In this case, I went straight to the umbrella, and then you go from there. And so in this case, I really liked the shape play that was happening with the little basket and the figures where they were positioned, this triangle of the basket to the figure on the left and the diagonal between the basket and the figure on the right. So my goal was to try to capture that. And I think I started roughly with the basket, but I don't know if you can see that there's a lot of marks on the basket, which means that it changed forms frequently. It changed shapes frequently, and it changed scale a little bit, but it was kind of the main focus to begin with. And then the basket became the measuring unit in the drawing. So then I would use it in a way, just like I was talking about with, look for your diagonals, look for the measuring unit, look for the basic shapes. I would use that as a way to, like, which direction was the figure going in relationship to the basket? Like, what are the diagonals? And then I would create these, like, this is like the science experiment, I'd create these like hypotheses of like, I think that there's a general form happening, and I'd start to make a mark. And then when it came time to building the table, that was, if I remember, like I wanted to make sure the basket didn't fall off the table. So the diagonals needed to make sense. And then I also wanted to make the table look bigger. And so I would extend a part of the diagonal out and also be mindful of the degree that diagonal is going in so that it takes up more space in the composition. There's a really interesting thing that happens when you're drawing from life perspective wise. And you could choose to ignore it or choose to accept it. It's a fisheye lens thing. So things naturally curve in space the way that our eyes see. And when you're drawing space, you could either adopt those curves or you could negate them. And in this case, I was negating them and I stuck to diagonals right here. Practice does make perfect. What happens when you practice is you become more aware of how the shapes and the size of those shapes influence the idea of space that you're creating. And then it becomes a system of figuring out which particular qualities of those forms need to be adjusted to get closer to where you want to go. So in this case, do I need to change the degree of the diagonal? Do I need to change the length of it? When I was drawing the figure sitting in the chair right here, you can see that I kept having a little bit of a fight with the arm of the chair. And so I kept like those marks there. And then I looked at like negative positive shape of the figure sitting in the chair here. And then I would look at like, okay, now there's a negative positive shape game where the chair ends and the wall behind the chair begins. And that goes back to like moving around the drawing, like just kind of swimming around the space and finding what kind of a neat drawing or design is going to come out depending on what you pick up on. And let me actually show you a piece that's showing that bend in space. So this is a sketch I did of my living room, and this was playing with that curve that happens in space. So if you look down, as you know, you'll notice that if you try to draw the direction of diagonals that are happening, you'll notice they start to curve. It's really neat. So if you follow that, you can create this really wonky, like fisheye effect. I have another one here. Oh, here it is. So look at how rather than going up vertically, there's this curve that's happening. So this is taking into account the ideas of how perspective works. Perspective means as things get further away, they get smaller. So if you go straight ahead, which is 1 point, things get further away and they get smaller. If you look in two different directions at once, that's 2 point perspective. You're looking at how objects are getting smaller as they get further away in two different directions. If you take into account looking up at something or looking down, you're starting to bring into the conversation 3 point perspective because you're looking at how it's getting smaller, further away, left, right, and then up or down. And if you do both up and down, that's 4 point perspective, okay? And so looking at how things kind of get smaller as they get further away, you'll notice there tends to be a bit of a curve that starts to appear. And sometimes you can explore that and have fun and exaggerate that curve, or you could negate that and just stick to a straight diagonal. But what I think is really interesting is if you look at and try to see the diagonals that are happening from your own observation, like, let's see if I could find that slide. If you do this right here, look at what the diagonals are doing right in front of you. You'll start to find that they eventually converge some point on your eye level. They might bend in space a bit, but it creates some really neat effects as you're kind of just experimenting with that. I know I kind of went off on a couple of tangents answering that question, but I hope that did answer a bit of it and kind of give more on top of that.
No, it actually helped. Thank you, Kat.
No problem. Thank you for asking.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I know it's 10 of 7 and we have a few questions too, but I didn't know how you wanted to wrap up. A few people are asking about how to show their drawings, and another question we had was someone asking if you could chat for a few minutes about your Loving Vincent film and your work with that. I don't know if you...
In a nutshell, a friend of mine sent me a link on Facebook. Social media is very powerful and helpful to connect. I advise everybody to have a social media habit to stay in touch with what's going on in the art world. So a friend reached out to me and told me about this film that was in the works, Loving Vincent, and it was right up the alley, which I was doing at the time, which was painting and animation combined. So I sent in all the application material, and I also made a painting with Vincent, an expression of Vincent van Gogh's face to the, I don't know if she was the creative director or one of the team managers. I can't remember her role, but I sent it in and I was like, hey, I'd love to work on this film. I was in the middle of teaching and I didn't hear back from the company for a good month and a half. And then serendipitously, as the semester was ending, I got a call. I got an email and they're like, I want you on the team in Poland, like now. So it was very spontaneous. And the semester had just ended. I hadn't put my grades in yet. And I was packing my suitcase, getting ready to fly out. I had an event scheduled to go to an opening with my friend, the chair of the department at the time. Forgot about the event. I flew out to Poland. She calls me. She's like, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "I'm in Poland. We'll catch up later." They put us in the training, but they didn't tell us was training. But they put us into this little training session where they said, "Take this painting and make an animation of it." It was a training / interview process where you needed to make sure your colors didn't blend. They stayed separated from each other, but there was a good consistency to them. And so the colors they had us putting side by side were very, very bleedy colors, like Prussian blue, which easily bleeds into other colors. Painters, you know Prussian blue, it's a strong color. And then cadmium lemon yellow. Not as strong as Prussian blue, but they touch each other and green starts to happen. So you wanted the paint to go side by side, very texturally, but not mix. If you're able to do that successfully, then you were on the team. So you're painting these pieces, they're 20 by 30 inches, each frame. And you want to make sure that your frame's approved by the supervisor. And after your frame's approved, you take a photo of it, and then you scrape out the frame to then animate the next frame. We were working on 12 frames a second, which if you work on twos goes to 24 frames as opposed to the 30 frames a second. And so if you had scenes where the character wasn't moving as much, you didn't have to do as much work. They had a tier system. I think it was either 1 to 7 or 1 to 10. They had a tier system of difficulty on the frames, and you were paid based on your tier system. So I think I was somewhere in the middle, like a 6 or a 7. I had portraiture, and then I had a lot of variations of blues to manage. I had palettes of blues, blue, lots of blues to manage. And so my scene was at the very end with Dr. Gachet, speaking with Armand, the man in the yellow jacket. And so you painted your scenes one frame at a time, which was like 20 by 30 inches. And then they took those frames and they put it into like more of the post-editing session where they compiled them to make these sequences that then were turned into the film. I think it was a 6-year process or a 7-year process. And they had, I forget how many animators on set, but they were starting to run out because the animators were kind of running dry. And they ended up inviting like maybe 60 or 80, I can't remember, it's been so long now, but they invited a few more from around the world. The thing is, you needed to be able to paint, draw, and animate. You needed all 3 of those in order to be able to do the job pretty well. And so it was interesting because there was a lot of different backgrounds on the team. There were some that were animators, not so much painters, and then vice versa. I was more in the painter, not so much animator world at the time. Now I'd say I'm kind of somewhere closer to the middle. But what was really neat about that was just looking at, you know, how a production like that's made, and like the pipeline process, you know, getting one part finished to be able to start the next part of the film, and then seeing it sewn together to create the final product. Is a really neat experience. I would recommend, this is for any artist, like if you have something you're really excited about, look at the details of what is required to get that idea done, and just kind of like just try it out. I think drawing is really important, a foundational thing, because if you could understand shape language, perspective, measuring, figure ground dynamics, then you have a language to then jump into whatever media that you want to work with. So in this case, Van Gogh was like a little bit of drawing mixed with color theory, mixed with animation. Okay, who has pieces they'd like to get feedback on?
Kat, I was wondering, maybe everyone or anyone who wanted to hold up their drawing, we could go to, we could all hold it up and go to the gallery view.
Yeah, that would be great.
If you guys, yeah, Kat, you can, if you want to hold your drawing up just to the video, or if you have photographed your drawing and want to
See.
I don't know how I don't think we can actually all screen share, so I don't
I'm
know.
seeing it. Oh, wow. Wow. Oh my gosh, Joanna's iPad, that living room setting is amazing. Molly DeShaw, I love the form. Look at the forms that you found on the still life. That looks like a waffle maker, Molly.
It is not a waffle maker. It's the printer,
Oh,
Kleenex and paper.
that's amazing.
And
That is absolutely amazing. Dina, it'd be so awesome to give people a chance to maybe email or take a photo and email or send the files somewhere.
Yeah,
That would be
totally.
really,
We'll follow up with a link that you can upload your image to.
yeah. Dina, hold up your drawing. I saw you had something.
Yeah, can you see it?
Here, hold it a little closer. Oh, yeah, I see it. Yeah, look at that space.
I kind of went a little crazy with the plants, but.
Sherry, I love worms. Yoni, look at the plant, Yoni. I love the space that you made, Yoni. Like there's a good sense of figure ground in yours. There's a large shape that looks like a couch occupying the lower right hand. And then the plant is sticking out on the rule of thirds really well. And then this perspective of the table it's sitting on is so clear. Helen K, can you hold yours? Yours looks amazing. Look at like your table. Like I can't tell if it's a file cabinet or what, but the table looks so like I can put my coffee on it. It's not going to fall. And then that looks like either a bookshelf or like I could see it. The structure's there. That's amazing. Rob, were you holding something up? Yeah, see, look at what Robert's done. He's kind of taken it an extra step compositionally, where he's creating a frame within his drawing surface to tell him where the drawing's going to begin and end. So that's going in a different, well, not a different, it's going in the direction of looking at design, right? And so rather than using your whole piece of paper as the edge of the frame, he created a frame for us. Linda, like I love how Linda's taken notes, and there's these really neat objects overlapping. And so I always love taking notes when I'm doing some sort of a sketch, because I'll learn something new and that'll kind of help when I look at the drawing later on. Marlene? Yeah, I could see it. I could see the light, the lamp. Epic. Marlene, that is a very dynamic like composition. You put the lamp all the way on one side of the drawing, and so that the rest of the space is open. Like I could see some really neat calligraphy or something going into that space. That's a really good framing. Eileen, that couch had fabulous. Yeah. And the window and the trees outside of it. Yeah, this is amazing. Y'all can see now that like you just go back to those basic tools. You got measuring, you got diagonals, you got negative positive shapes, basic shape assessment, you know, and having fun, you know, and just kind of giving yourself a break, coming back and looking at it. And that's, you can create like this, like it'd be so neat. This is the zine coming out of me, the publication person. Imagine taking your drawings and then photographing them and creating little booklets, and it's like your life. I don't know, it's just your living room, like when friends come to visit, or if you have a place that you frequent and you get a chance to like, it becomes a part of your life. You know, you're documenting your life and your experience and all these neat components that make it up. So yeah, this was such a great experience for me. I really enjoyed being here with you guys, and I love the work. I love the pieces. I'd love to see more of it.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of awesome comments, so check them out, Kat. Everyone really liked the workshop, but it's amazing to have so many people join us and that you're interested in drawing and taking the time out to practice. And we'll be following up with an email. I'll attach a link for if you want to send along your images for feedback. And I just want to thank Kat for your time and for teaching such a great lesson and walking us through drawing. We will have other drawing workshops, so we'll update you with that. And then also we'll have the recording of this workshop. So if you want to go back into your drawing or re-listen and do another drawing session while listening to Kat's workshop, that would be great. And you can join us. We have other workshops in our series, the Co-Creative Sessions. It's on our website. It's cocreativenb.org. And Kat, do you want to mention where people can find your work?
Sure, yes. So I have a Instagram that I post my work on regularly. It's Kat Knutsen Art. There's my website that kind of is a catalog of the work that I've done. It's katknutsen.com, www. And yeah, I post information about, you know, upcoming events on my Instagram. I have a Facebook page that's just Kat Knutsen. You know, you could find that's like an art page, and if there's an event coming up, I'll post information about it there. But if you want to look at more of my work, you can see it on my website. I use that as kind of an archival location. And I think I still have some of my student work. I try to keep my student work available so that way it can show that growth that's happened. I started making art when I was 24, and I had amazing instructors. I started at the community college level in North Carolina, and I had amazing, amazing mentors, and they gave us that freedom to be able to explore an idea, explore materials, and then a foundation to like take learning art to a different level. So yeah, like doesn't matter where you're starting from, you just give yourself that chance to practice over time and give yourself that creative freedom and give yourself that foundation with these tools. And I'm really excited to see what you'd create down the road. So thank you, everybody.